A headline can influence our impression of a study before we've read a single detail. Take a claim like, ultra-processed foods link to 40% higher cancer risk. While this is a fictionalized headline, it reflects the kind of health claim many people encounter regularly. That headline is doing several things at once. It names something familiar, it gives you a number, and it connects both to something frightening. So if it catches your attention, that makes sense. But a headline is not the research. It's a compressed interpretation of the research. And compression changes things. It can remove context. It can smooth over uncertainty. And it can make a finding sound broader, stronger, or more personally relevant than it actually is. That's not to say health research doesn't matter. It does. And if a headline is based on a real study, it starts from a stronger place than a claim based on nothing. But evidence still needs context before it becomes useful. So the problem isn't necessarily that health headlines are wrong. The problem is that they often leave out the conditions that make a finding meaningful. In this video, we'll look at how that compression happens and how to read health headlines more carefully without needing to become a scientist. Let's go back to the example. Ultra-processed foods link to 40% higher cancer risk. At first glance, it seems clear. One food category, one disease category, one number. But before that headline can tell us what the finding really means, we need to ask a few questions. Like, what kind of study was this? What were the conditions? Was it an experimental study? Meaning, did researchers actively test what happens when something changes? Or was it an observational study? Meaning, did researchers observe patterns in existing behavior or data without directly intervening? Was it following people over time? Or was it analyzing patterns in existing data? Those differences matter. They can affect how the data is interpreted, and ultimately what conclusions can be drawn from the findings. What's more, a study may find an association between variables or events without proving that one directly caused the other. But that doesn't make the study useless. It just changes what we can responsibly conclude from it. If people who eat more ultra-processed foods have higher rates of certain cancers, that is worth paying attention to. But it also raises follow-up questions. What counted as an ultra-processed food, and how much consumption was linked to higher cancer rates? Which types of cancers were included? What were the characteristics of the study groups? Were there differences in exposure to other known risk factors, like smoking or alcohol consumption? Were there differences in broader lifestyle patterns, like exercise or overall diet quality? Were there differences in social or economic factors, like income, education, or access to healthcare? These questions matter because the groups being compared may differ in more ways than the headline suggests. And those differences can affect how we interpret the study, how confidently the findings should be presented, and how carefully the headline should be constructed. A good study will often try to adjust for some of these factors. In other words, researchers may use statistical methods to account for measured differences between groups. That can make the analysis more careful, but adjustment is not magic. It can reduce some of the noise in the data, the extra variation that might make a relationship look stronger, weaker, or clearer than it really is. But it cannot account for everything. It can only adjust for factors that were measured, included, and modeled appropriately. So even after adjustment, the finding still needs to be interpreted with care, and this is where the distance between the study and the headline begins to matter. The headline may say, linked to higher cancer risk, but the study may be saying something more careful, more nuanced, like, in this population, higher intake was associated with increased risk after adjusting for certain measured factors. That is much less dramatic, but it's also more accurate. And often, that extra precision is exactly what gets compressed when constructing headlines. We can see this more clearly by revisiting the example. In this headline, the word linked is doing a lot of heavy lifting. In research language, linked to often means there's an association between variables. What this means is that two things appeared together in the data more often than expected. But that association does not automatically imply that one thing is causing the observed change in the other. However, when we move from research language to everyday everyday language, linked to can start to sound stronger than it actually is. Without this subtle distinction, linked to can begin to sound like raises your risk. And then in a social media post or short video, that can become this food causes cancer. And by the time it reaches the viewer, the message may feel even simpler. If I eat this, I'm putting myself in danger. That is a major shift. The original study may have been much more cautious. Then, the headline became shorter. After that, the social post became more dramatic, and the final impression became much more certain than the evidence from the original study itself. But the focus here isn't solely on the headline. It's also about the distance between the study and the message people actually receive. The study might say, we observed an association between higher ultra-processed food consumption and increased rates of certain health outcomes, including some cancers. Then, a headline might say, high ultra-processed food consumption is linked to cancer. After that, a social post might say, ultra-processed foods raise your risk of cancer. And finally, a viewer might hear, ultra-processed foods cause cancer. At each step, the message becomes more compressed. Some of the context is stripped away, and eventually the meaning begins to change. But that's not all. At each step, the emotional weight also changes. Because cancer risk is not a neutral phrase. It stirs up fear, it also creates urgency, and that urgency can make information feel more actionable than it actually is, even before it's fully understood. To be clear, that doesn't mean people should ignore the headline. It means the headline should be treated as a starting point, not the final conclusion. So when you see an alarming health headline or social post, the goal is not to dismiss it. Instead, the goal is to slow it down. A few simple questions can change how you interpret it. First, ask, what was actually studied? If we go back to the example, we'd ask, was it ultra-processed foods as a broad category or a specific subgroup, like sugary drinks, packaged snacks, processed meats, or ready meals? Was it a specific type of processing or a certain formulation of additives, ingredients, or preservatives? Because ultra-processed food is a broad label, and not every item inside that category is identical. So we shouldn't assume that every ultra-processed food is equally concerning or unhealthy. Second, ask, what do the numbers actually show? Looking at the example headline again, we might ask, how large is the risk in absolute terms? A 40% higher risk sounds large, but it's useful to ask, 40% higher than what baseline? The baseline risk means the starting point, how common the outcome was before the increase. If the baseline risk is very small, the absolute change may still be small. On the other hand, if the baseline risk is already high, the same relative increase may matter much more. The percentage alone does not tell you the full story. Third, ask, who was studied? Were adults studied or children? Was the study limited to people in one country or people with a specific health profile? Asking about the study population is important because a finding can be real in one group but may be limited in its generalizability. It may not apply equally to everyone. Fourth, ask, was the study showing association or causation? This is one of the most important questions. Experimental studies are usually better suited to testing cause and effect because researchers actively change something and observe what happens as a result. Whereas if a study is observational, researchers may follow people, collect information, and look for relationships in the data. The study can identify patterns, but because researchers are observing existing conditions and behaviors rather than assigning an intervention, the groups being compared may differ in other important ways. So it usually cannot prove by itself that one thing directly caused another. That doesn't make it meaningless. Quite the contrary, many useful health signals begin as observed patterns. But it does mean we should be careful about turning an association into a rule. And fifth, finally ask, what context might be missing? Ask questions like, what else differs between the groups being compared? What did the study adjust for? What could it not measure? What were its limitations? Have other studies found similar results? These questions don't make the headline useless. They may actually make it more useful because they shift the headline from something that feels like a final warning into something closer to a starting point. And once you restore the context, the claim becomes easier to put into perspective, not as something to panic over, not as something to dismiss, but as one piece of evidence that needs to be understood in proportion. This matters because health information doesn't stay on the page. It becomes real world behavior. A headline can change what people eat, what they avoid, what they fear, what they buy, what they share. And this is especially important now because health claims don't only come from health agencies, medical and academic institutions, scientific journals, or newspapers. They come from a wider variety of sources: influencers, short form videos, podcasts, newsletters, public figures. Sometimes they come from professionals who have relevant training or credentials but still present research more confidently than the evidence strictly allows. And from another side, they also come from people with no meaningful understanding of the science, but who still make huge claims with enormous confidence. So the solution is not to reject science altogether, nor is it to treat every headline as manipulation, and it's not to assume that every simplified claim is useless. The solution is to become a better interpreter of the information, because a headline based on research starts from a stronger place than a claim based on nothing. But evidence still needs context before it becomes useful. So the goal is not perfect expertise. Most people do not need to read every study in full. They don't need to run the analyses themselves, but they can learn to ask better questions. And sometimes that's enough to change how a claim lands. Health headlines are often trying to do something difficult. They are trying to turn complex research into something concise enough for people to notice. That compression is not always dishonest, but it's rarely neutral. It shapes what feels important, what feels certain, and what feels personally relevant. So when you see a headline like ultra processed foods linked to higher cancer risk, the best response is not panic. And it's not dismissal. The best response is curiosity. It's asking relevant questions like, what was studied? Who was studied? What kind of evidence is this? How large is the risk? And what context might be missing? Those questions can create space between the headline and your conclusion. And that space matters because health decisions should not be shaped only by the most dramatic version of a finding. They should be shaped by evidence, context, and careful interpretation. A headline can point you toward research, but it should not replace the work of understanding what that research actually means.